The rope was not meant for her. That's the first thing you gotta understand about what happened in Colton Miles's barn. The rope was for a horse, a wild Mustang to be exact, the kind that ran like thunder along the canyon rim, their manes catching the last light of day. A horse meant trade, trade meant coin, and coin meant not starving to death when the winter snows came to choke the valley. Simple as that. So when Colton pushed open his heavy barn door that morning, the pale dawn light spilling in like watered-down milk, he was expecting to see a wild-eyed horse, kicking and fighting against the snare he'd so carefully laid. What he saw instead stopped his heart cold. It was a girl. She sat in the straw, perfectly still. Her wrists were caught in the loop of his rope, pulled taut to a beam above her head. But she wasn't struggling. She wasn't crying. She sat upright, her posture as straight and proud as a canyon pine, and she just watched him. The first thing he noticed were her eyes. They were dark, so dark they seemed to swallow the light, and they were steady. Way too steady for someone caught in a trap. She should have been panicking, fighting, screaming for help. Instead, she looked at him with the same cool, calculating interest a hawk shows a field mouse just before the dive. It was the kind of look that made the hair on your arms stand up. Colton's throat went dry. He was a simple man. He knew horses, he knew the land, he knew the quiet loneliness of his remote ranch. He did not know what to do with an Apache girl sitting in his barn as if she owned the place. He finally found his voice, though it came out as a rough whisper. You could have cut yourself loose. He gestured with his chin. His hunting knife was lying on a nearby barrel. He'd left it there last night, an oversight he was now kicking himself for. It was well within her reach. She could have been free hours ago. She had made no move for it. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. It didn't reach her eyes. I know. Those two words hit him harder than a punch. They rattled in the quiet barn, filled with a meaning he couldn't grasp. A scream would have made sense. A plea would have made sense. But this calm certainty, it was all wrong. He followed her gaze upward to the thick wooden beam above her head, and his stomach twisted into a knot of ice. There were carvings in the wood, fresh ones, gouged deep, the raw wood showing pale against the dark, aged timber. They were intricate symbols, swirling patterns he recognized from a distance, the kind of markings he'd seen on Apache war shields. But these weren't just decorations. They weren't random. They looked like warnings. Colton's voice dropped even lower, barely a breath. Who taught you our language? Her smile widened just a fraction, but her eyes turned as cold as a winter river. The same person who told me about the 3 riders heading for your village. She paused, letting the words hang in the air between them, heavy as stones. The ones who aren't coming to trade. Colton froze. His blood felt like it was turning to slush in his veins. The canyon trail had been empty for weeks. He would have seen tracks. He would have heard a rumor from a passing trapper. There were no riders. It was impossible. He lived on the edge of everything, the first to see anyone coming or going. He would have known. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He opened his mouth to call her a liar, to demand answers. But before a single word could escape his lips, a sound drifted through the thin morning air. It was distant, faint, but it was steady, and it was unmistakable. Hoofbeats. His blood ran cold. He spun around, grabbing his rifle from the pegs on the wall, his hands trembling so badly he could barely work the lever. He pressed his ear to the cracks in the barn wall, straining to listen, praying he was wrong. The sound grew louder, clearer, 3 horses, just as she'd said. He turned back to her, his mind reeling. She hadn't moved an inch. She just watched him with that same unnerving calm, as if this whole impossible morning, from the snare to the riders, was unfolding exactly according to her design. The hoofbeats came first as a whisper against the dry earth, a faint vibration he felt more in his bones than heard with his ears. Then they grew into a steady, rhythmic drumming that seemed to make the very walls of the barn tremble. Colton's heart pounded in time with each strike, a frantic drumbeat of its own. His grip on the worn stock of his rifle was so tight his knuckles were white. It didn't make a lick of sense. He'd ridden the length of the trail himself just yesterday at sunset. No tracks, no distant dust clouds hanging on the horizon. Nothing. The canyon was as empty and silent as a tomb. Yet here they were. 3 riders, approaching his isolated homestead with a grim purpose you could feel in the air. Across the barn, the Apache girl, Ayanna, sat like a statue carved from stone. The ropes bit deep into her wrists, but her expression was a mask of unreadable calm. When the thudding of hooves finally stopped just outside the barn, a silence fell that was louder and more terrifying than the noise it replaced. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a razor. Calm, almost taunting. "I told you they would come." Colton's stomach clenched. How? How could she possibly have known? Boots hit the ground outside. Gravel crunched under heavy heels. He heard the murmur of low voices, harsh and confident, the sound of men who weren't used to being told no. The barn door groaned open on its leather hinges, spilling a harsh rectangle of daylight across the straw-strewn floor, and 3 men stepped inside, their shapes silhouetted against the morning glare. The leader drew the eye immediately. He was tall and lean, coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. He moved with the quiet, deadly assurance of a man who had ended lives before and hadn't lost a minute of sleep over it. A jagged scar, old and white, ran from his temple to his jaw, twisting his face into a permanent sneer. His eyes were a startlingly cold blue, and they swept the room with predatory assessment, lingering first on Ayanna, then flicking to Colton, as if he were trying to decide which of them was the bigger nuisance. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice rough and edged like a rusty blade. "Looks like we found ourselves a little Apache bird." His gaze slid back to Colton, a cruel amusement dancing in his eyes, and the fool who thought he could cage her. Colton raised the rifle, trying to keep it steady, though his hands betrayed him with a faint tremor. "This is my land. You're trespassing." The scarred man let out a sharp, humorless laugh that chilled the air. "Property lines don't mean much out here, friend. Not when you're hiding someone who should have been in the ground 3 days ago." Another man stepped forward from behind him. This one was shorter, stockier, with a thick neck and shifty eyes that darted nervously around the barn, never settling on one place for more than a second. "She saw us, Pike," the man muttered, his voice a nervous rasp. "At the Morrison place. She knows what we did." Colton's breath hitched in his chest. The Morrison place. He turned his head sharply, his eyes locking on the girl. She didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. She simply lifted her chin a fraction, her voice as steady and hard as Riverstone. "I saw everything." The scarred man, Pike, smiled then, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a wolf baring its teeth, the smile of a man who had already decided that blood was going to be spilled before the sun was high in the sky. Colton's knuckles turned ghost white around the stock of his rifle. The girl's words hung in the dusty air like a death sentence waiting to be carried out. And in the ringing silence that followed, he could hear nothing but the frantic, terrified thumping of his own heart. The Morrison family. The name echoed in the silent chambers of Colton's memory. He remembered their laughter, clear and bright, the last time he'd traded with them for seed corn. He could almost smell the fresh bread that was always drifting from their cozy cabin, could almost feel the solid, reassuring clasp of Old Man Morrison's hand in farewell. Gone. All of them. Slaughtered. Ayanna's voice cut through the hazy fog of his thoughts. It was calm, but it was merciless. "I watched you ride into their homestead at dusk. You told them you were just looking for food and shelter for the night." Pike's cruel smile faltered, just for a second. A shadow flickered across his scarred face. She pressed on, her dark eyes unblinking, pinning him in place. "Then, when they trusted you, when they sat you down at their own table, you slit James Morrison's throat while he was saying grace." The stocky man, Carl, flinched as if he'd been struck. The third man, a lanky, restless figure with a perpetually twitching hand near his pistol, just stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. "His wife screamed," Ayanna continued, her voice never wavering. "Your man," she nodded towards the stocky one, "silenced her with a woodsman's axe by the door." Colton felt the world tilt on its axis. The barn seemed to spin around him. Every detail she spoke was too sharp, too vivid. They matched the fragmented, whispered rumors he'd heard from a passing trapper just days before. Rumors he had desperately prayed were nothing but tall tales. But here it was, spoken plain as day. "The children tried to run," she said, her voice dropping, taking on an edge of cold fury. "You shot the boy in the back as he scrambled for the woods." Her jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in her cheek. "The little girl—" Silence. "You burned the cabin with her still inside." The stocky outlaw, Carl, finally broke, his face slick with sweat. "She's lying, Pike. She's gotta be." But Ayanna's gaze never left Pike's. "Your boots gave you away," she said, her voice soft, but carrying to every corner of the barn. "The left heel is worn down clear to the nail. I saw the print in the ash after you left." Instinctively, Colton's eyes dropped to Pike's feet. The left boot heel was worn down exactly as she described. Pike finally broke. He snarled, a guttural sound of pure rage, and shoved his pistol forward, the barrel pressing hard against Ayanna's chest. "Enough!" The third man, the lanky one named Silas, hissed under his breath. "She knows too much. If she talks, every town from here to Prescott will have a rope waiting for us." "She won't talk," Pike growled, his cold blue eyes glittering with a murderous light. He pressed the barrel of the gun harder against Ayanna's ribs, making her grunt. "Because she won't live to see another sunrise." Colton's breath caught in his throat. It hit him then, a realization as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. This girl wasn't just a captive. She wasn't just a witness. She was the only living witness to a horrific massacre. And if she died here, in his barn, the last hope of justice for the Morrison family died with her. The barrel of Pike's pistol gleamed in the dim light, a single deadly point of steel. Its shadow stretched long and menacing across the barn wall. His voice was low, dangerous, every word a threat wrapped in iron. "You've got one choice, rancher. Hand over the girl and maybe I let you keep breathing. You stand in my way and you'll die right here with her." Colton's grip on his rifle was slick with sweat. His mouth had gone completely dry. He was no fool. He had no illusions about his chances. 3 guns against 1 was a death sentence out here. There was no law, no help for miles. But giving her up, handing this girl over to a butcher like Pike, he wasn't sure he could live with that kind of cowardice staining his soul. It was then that Ayanna rose slowly from the straw. Her wrists were still bound, but she moved with a grace that defied the ropes. Her face was as calm as a summer lake, as if Pike's pistol were nothing more than a child's toy pointed her way. "You think the choice belongs to him?" she said, her voice soft, yet it carried an incredible weight. It never did. The stocky outlaw, Carl, frowned, his shifty eyes glancing between her and Pike. "What's she talking about? Why ain't she scared?" "She should be begging," the lanky one, Silas, muttered, a flicker of unease in his eyes. But Ayanna only took a step closer to the light pouring through the doorway, her voice as steady as stone. "You came here thinking you were the hunters." Her eyes met Pike's. "You were wrong. You've walked into a trap of your own making." Pike's laugh was sharp and brittle, like ice cracking underfoot. A trap? There's 3 of us, girl, and we're armed. You're bound hand and foot. And this fool rancher is shaking like a leaf in a storm. Where's the trap? And then it happened. The faintest creak of wood from above. The whisper of movement from just beyond the barn walls. Shadows shifted in the cracks between the boards. Colton held his breath. Someone else was out there. Carl stiffened, jerking his head toward the wall, his eyes wide. Did you hear that? Another sound, softer this time, a rustle of straw in the hayloft above them. The floorboards groaned under a weight that wasn't there a moment ago. A weight that wasn't theirs. Ayana's eyes locked on Pike's, unwavering, relentless. You thought you cornered me, but I led you here. Every step you took, every mile you rode, I made sure you were following my trail. The barn suddenly seemed to shrink around them. The air grew thick, heavy with a palpable dread. Pike's hand twitched on the grip of his pistol, his raw confidence finally beginning to crack and splinter. Outside, a voice thundered in the Apache tongue. It was strong, commanding, filled with authority. The outlaws' faces drained of all color, and in that one, heart-stopping moment, Pike Morrison finally realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. The voice that rolled like thunder from outside the barn was deep and powerful, an ancient sound that spoke of mountains and wind. Before Pike could even bark an order, before his men could raise their guns, an arrow split the air. Thwack! It slammed into the wooden plank right beside Pike's head. The shaft quivered, humming with energy. Its sharpened steel tip buried a good 2 inches deep in the timber. It was so close to his scar, it could have been a new one. Down! Carl yelped, stumbling backward and tripping over his own feet as a second arrow punched through the opposite wall, sending a shower of straw and dust into the air. Silas, the lanky one, swore a string of panicked curses, his eyes darting wildly to every crack, every shadow. The barn, which moments ago had felt like their fortress, had instantly turned into a cage, a kill box. Colton's pulse hammered in his ears, a frantic rhythm against the sudden, deadly silence. Through the gaps in the walls, he could make out figures moving in the dust-filtered light. Shadows circling the barn with the silent, patient deadliness of wolves. Their footfalls were deliberate, steady, surrounding them on all sides. Whoever was out there, they weren't in a hurry. They knew they had them. Ayana stood taller now, her shoulders squared as if the ropes on her wrists were nothing, as if she had shed their weight entirely. Her calm was no longer unnerving. It was a weapon, a knife that cut through the outlaws' rising panic. My brother, Nahuel, has been following you since the moment you rode away from the Morrison place, she said, her voice clear and ringing. Every turn you took, every campfire you built, every lie you told yourselves that you were safe, he saw it all. Carl scrambled to his feet and spun on her, his face slick with the sheen of pure terror. You led us here. Her dark eyes locked onto his, unblinking and merciless. I chose this place. I chose this moment. You were never in control. Pike snarled, but the raw edge of fear cracked his voice. You expect me to believe you planned all this? That you got yourself caught on purpose? Ayana simply tilted her head toward the far wall. On cue, another arrow slammed into the wood with a solid, final-sounding thud. This one was different. It carried a small strip of colored cloth tied to its shaft, a piece of calico that fluttered like a signal flag in the drafty barn. Believe it or not, Pike Morrison, she said, her voice dropping, you have already lost. My people surround you, but they are not alone. She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of her next words gather. The sheriff of Willowbrook rides with them. The lanky outlaw's hand trembled so badly on his revolver he almost dropped it. Pike, what if she's telling the truth? What if it's all a setup? Pike's face was a tight, ugly mask of fury and disbelief. His jaw worked as he desperately tried to hold on to the last shred of his authority. But the barn was alive now, whispering with the sounds of the hunters outside. Every arrow that struck, every rustle in the grass, proved Ayana's words were true. Colton watched her then, a wave of stunning realization washing over him. She hadn't been caught in his snare by accident. She hadn't stumbled into his trap. She had walked into it willingly. It was just another piece of a plan so much larger, so much more intricate than he could ever have imagined. She had used his simple rope to weave a net of her own. Pike's wild, desperate eyes darted around the barn. The shadows were pressing in on him, alive and menacing. The arrows, the whispers in Apache, the steady, unnerving silence of the men who had them surrounded. It was too much. With a sudden guttural roar of pure, cornered animal rage, he grabbed the nearest wooden keg and hurled it to the ground. The wood split open with a sharp crack, and the biting, chemical reek of lamp oil filled the air. The clear liquid bled across the dry straw, spreading in a dark, glistening stain. Colton swore under his breath, jerking the rifle tighter to his shoulder. "You'll kill us all!" "That's the point!" Pike snapped back, his face twisted into a mad grin, his eyes burning with a terrifying light. "If I'm going to hang for this, I'll take you, this whole damn barn, and all your redskin friends with me." He struck a match against the sole of his worn-out boot. The sulfur head flared bright in the dim barn, a tiny, terrible star of destruction. The little flame danced between his fingers. Every outlaw in the room froze, their own fear now tangled up with their leader's suicidal rage. Carl stumbled back from the spreading pool of oil, shaking his head frantically. "Pike, don't! You'll roast us alive!" "Better than rotting in a cell," Pike spat, his voice raw. The match hovered, trembling, just inches above the slick trail of fuel. His hand was shockingly steady, a stark contrast to the sweat dripping from his brow. Then Ayana moved. She stepped lightly across the barn floor, her bound hands shifting in a way Colton didn't understand. Her voice was steady, cutting through the panic like steel through cloth. "You think fire will save you?" She took another step. "Look where you stand." Pike's mad grin faltered. He glanced down. The oil had run thickest right at his own feet, seeping into the cracked leather of his boots, darkening the floorboards in a wide circle all around him. He was standing on an island of his own making. With a sudden, swift movement, Ayana nudged a heavy water barrel with her heel. The barrel tipped, sending a wave of murky water cascading over the straw. It doused the oil's trail, soaking the floor everywhere, except for the small, isolated patch of fuel-soaked straw right where Pike was standing. His eyes widened. The horrifying realization settled in his gut like a stone. "You'll burn," Ayana said, her voice as cold as the grave, "but you'll burn alone." For the first time since he'd walked in, Pike Morrison hesitated. The match trembled between his fingers. His men exchanged panicked, desperate looks, edging away from him as if the fire had already started, as if he were already a ghost. The suffocating smell of oil clung to the air, and the silence that followed was more dangerous than any flame. The silence in the barn stretched as thin and tight as a wire. The only sound was the soft hiss of the lamp oil soaking deeper into the straw at Pike's feet. He stood there, the monster of the territories, boots glistening with fuel, the tiny, flickering match still trembling between his fingers. His grin had vanished, replaced by a desperate snarl. But behind the rage in his eyes, something new was lurking, raw, naked fear. The stocky outlaw, Carl, shifted his weight and let out a sharp wince. Colton saw it then. A dark stain was spreading across the man's sleeve. Blood, dripping slow and steady from a gash on his forearm that hadn't been tended to, an arrow wound. The reality of their situation was bleeding out right in front of them. Carl's breathing came in ragged, sharp inhales. He looked from Pike's mad eyes to the silent, menacing walls of the barn, and something inside him finally broke. He staggered forward, letting his revolver fall from his hand with a heavy clatter. "I can't do this, Pike," he rasped, his voice cracking. He raised his hands high in the air. "I'm done. I'm finished." "Pick up that gun," Pike barked, his own voice breaking under the strain. Carl just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the shadows outside the barn door. "They'll kill us all if we fight. But maybe they'll spare me if I surrender." He took another careful step, his boots squelching in the water-soaked straw. "I'm not dying for you." From beyond the walls, Nahuel's voice rang out again, deep and commanding, this time in clear English. "Step forward, Carl Hendries. Throw down your weapon and you will not be harmed." The man froze, his shoulders slumping in relief. He nodded to himself, a quick jerky motion, and then began to edge his way toward the barn door, desperation written in every trembling movement. The lanky outlaw, Silas, cursed under his breath, panic finally cutting through his bravado. "Pike, he's right. We ain't walking out of this if we stick with you. This is over." "Shut your mouth!" Pike snapped, the match quivering dangerously in his grip. His face was a twisted ruin, half fury, half terror. "You think they'll let you live once she starts talking? You think the sheriff won't hang you same as me?" But his words had lost their power. They were hollow threats from a king who had lost his kingdom. The gang's foundation of fear was cracking and crumbling right beneath his feet. Carl was already halfway to the door, his hands raised high above his head. Silas hung back, his shifty eyes darting between Pike's trembling match and the oil-soaked floor, his mind racing. Pike's hand trembled harder now, the little flame shaking with it. His own men, the only thing that had ever given him power, were slipping from his grasp like sand through his fingers. And for the first time, the scarred killer looked less like a wolf and more like a cornered animal, ready to tear itself apart rather than face the cage that was closing in around him. The barn doors groaned, the old hinges crying out as they were pulled open from the outside. A flood of bright morning sunlight poured in, making everyone squint. Pike spun, his gun half raised, his face a mask of primal fear. He was expecting a storm of arrows, a volley of rifle fire to cut him down where he stood. What he saw instead froze him to the spot. Sheriff Marcus Webb strode in first. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. His badge caught the light, glinting like a star on his chest. His rifle was held steady in his hands, not pointed but ready, and behind him came a dozen men from Willowbrook. Farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, men Colton knew by face if not by name. Each one was armed. Each one's face was grim with purpose. And in their shadow, slipping in with the silent, fluid steps of ghosts, came the Apache. Warriors, a dozen of them, their faces painted for battle, bows drawn taut, rifles leveled. Their eyes were sharp and unflinching, missing nothing. The two groups, settlers and Apache, men who had spent their lives mistrusting and fighting each other, now filled the barn entrance together. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their combined presence as solid and immovable as a mountain range. Colton's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen such a sight in all his years. It was impossible. It was a miracle. Pike's face drained of the last of its color, leaving it a sickly, pasty white. "No," he whispered, the match still trembling forgotten in his fingers. That's not possible. Settlers don't ride with savages. They kill each other. They always have." Ayanna stepped forward, her calm unbroken, her voice cutting through the heavy, stunned silence. "That's what you counted on, didn't you, Pike? That hatred, that mistrust. You thought it would hide you, that it would act as your shield. But while you were hunting me, my brother was riding for the sheriff, and for the first time, the sheriff listened." Webb's voice rang out, steady as a church bell on Sunday morning. "You'll answer for what you did to the Morrison family, Pike. You'll answer before both our peoples, and there'll be no slipping away this time." The lanky outlaw Silas staggered back, his courage completely unraveling as the horrifying truth of their situation crashed down on him. The numbers were overwhelming. Apache shadows outside, armed settlers inside, every single rifle barrel and arrowhead in the valley aimed his way. Ayana's eyes locked on Pike. "You thought you had power here," she said, her voice low and intense. "But the truth is simple. You are outnumbered more than 20 to 1. Justice isn't just coming for you, Pike." She took a final step toward him. "It's already here." Pike's hand shook so violently that the match finally fell from his grip. He turned in a slow, stumbling circle, his wild eyes taking in the scene. Every escape route was cut off. Every path was blocked by a wall of grim, determined faces, united against him. For the first time, the scarred killer looked smaller than the flame he had tried to wield. He was just a man, surrounded not only by his enemies, but by the living, breathing proof that his whole world of fear and division was coming to an end. The match slipped from Pike's numb fingers. It fell, tumbling end over end, and hissed out in a damp patch of straw near his boots, extinguished before it could ever become a threat. For a single, long heartbeat, the barn was utterly silent. Every man, every woman, Apache and settler alike, just watched him. It was as if the world itself had paused to witness his downfall. His chest heaved. All the fury, all the madness, seemed to drain out of him at once, leaving behind something far uglier: defeat. He let out a ragged, choking laugh, a sound with no humor in it at all. "We killed him for nothing," he muttered, his eyes unfocused, staring at some distant, terrible memory. His voice cracked under the weight of his own words. "There weren't no gold, no treasure. Just lies." A chill crawled down Colton's spine. The Morrison family, their children, slaughtered for a rumor. Innocent lives erased from the earth for nothing more than greed and smoke. Sheriff Webb stepped forward, the iron of the law in his voice. "That's enough, Pike. You'll answer for every drop of blood you spilled." He drew a pair of heavy iron shackles from his belt, the steel glinting in the morning light. Pike didn't fight. He didn't resist. As the cold cuffs closed around his wrists with a final metallic click, the scarred killer who had terrorized the frontier for years stood bent and bound, his head lowered like a beaten dog. His men followed his lead. Carl, pale and trembling, stumbled into the custody of 2 Apache warriors, who took his arms without a word. The lanky Silas let his revolver clatter to the dusty ground, too shaken to even think of resisting. Ayana's gaze never left Pike. "You burned children for whispers," she said, her voice quiet, but each word struck him like a hammer blow. "And you thought no one would remember." Outside, the gathered warriors and settlers formed a silent, solemn wall of witnesses. Faces that had once glared at each other with generations of mistrust now stood side by side, unified by the sight of justice finally taking its course. Apache bows were lowered in unison with settler rifles, not in surrender, but in a shared, silent acknowledgement. A new chapter was being written. Pike lifted his head one last time, his eyes burning with a final, desperate flicker of defiance. But there was no one left to follow him. There was no one left to fear him. Sheriff Webb pulled the prisoner toward the light of day. The outlaws shuffled after him, swallowed by the eyes of 2 peoples who had once been enemies, but were now bound forever by a shared loss, and by a justice that had been long, long denied. Colton let out a slow, shuddering breath, realizing he had just witnessed something no man in Willowbrook would have ever believed possible. For the first time, the land itself felt different, as if the very ground beneath his feet recognized that a line had been crossed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The barn smelled different now. There was no lingering trace of lamp oil, no ghostly echo of fear clinging to its wooden beams. Instead, the air was warm and thick with the smell of stew simmering in heavy iron pots, the sweet tang of cornbread cooling on makeshift tables, and the faint, pleasant smoke of a communal fire crackling in the pit just outside the doors. Laughter rose to the rafters, where once only silence and dread had lived. Children darted between the empty stalls, some with dark braids flying behind them, some with straw-colored hair, their games spilling across the hayloft with joyful shrieks. Apache women were trading herbs with the settler wives, laying out bundles of dried roots and powders on blankets, their hands moving in patient explanation. Farmers were showing their new neighbors how to mend a broken plow and shape iron nails at Colton's small forge. For the first time in anyone's memory, the people of Willowbrook and the Apache were sharing more than a weary, suspicious glance across a rifle barrel. They were sharing a future. Colton leaned against the weathered frame of the barn door, his arms folded across his chest, watching it all unfold as if it were a dream. Just a few months ago, these very walls had trapped 3 killers and had come within a hair's breadth of burning down with them. Now, they held something far more fragile, but infinitely stronger than any flame. Trust. Ayanna moved among the crowd with a quiet, steady purpose, a leather satchel of herbs and remedies slung over her shoulder. She paused to show a settler child how to braid sweetgrass into a fragrant rope, her voice soft, her smile a rare but genuine thing. When her eyes found Colton's, she walked over, her presence as calm and centered as it had been the morning he first laid eyes on her in that snare. "Hard to believe it all started right here," he said, his voice quiet, gesturing to the lantern-lit barn, now alive with voices and the warmth of community. She tilted her head, her gaze sweeping the room, taking it all in. "I only led them to this place," she said. "The rest, they chose to build themselves." Colton studied her for a moment. The woman who had walked into a trap to set a trap of her own, who had gambled her life on the hope that old enemies could find common ground. You risked everything, your life, your freedom, all for this. Ayanna's dark eyes softened, though her voice still carried the same core of steel it always had. "Justice was never just about Pike Morrison," she said. "It was about proving that enemies don't have to stay enemies, that a shared future is stronger than a divided past." Outside, the sun dipped low behind the canyon rim, painting the horizon in streaks of fire and gold. For once, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. And as the sound of shared laughter spilled out into the twilight, Colton knew that Ayanna's incredible gamble had changed more than just a single village. It had changed the land itself. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these.